Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and start now. Can my co-panelists shake your head if you can hear me, okay? Yes, perfect. Okay, thank you. So welcome to Monument to Movement's very first Let's Speak Easy conversation. My co-founder and co-artistic director, Jane Sachs, and I would like to welcome you today. And excuse me, we also welcome Heather Shirey and Todd Lawrence. I'm so sorry, I'm having a technical problem. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, my screen was a little crazy and I think we're back now. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we'd like to welcome Heather Shirey and Todd Lawrence, the co-directors of the Urban Art Mapping Project. Todd is also Associate Professor of English and American Culture and Difference at the University of St. Thomas. And Heather Shirey is Professor of Art History at the University of St. Paul. Behind the scenes, we would also like to acknowledge Kelsey Bogdan, who is running our Zoom tech today, and our M2M operations strategist, Marcela Andrade. So we thank you all so much for helping us develop this program today and for joining us. Before we get started, I have just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, this program is going to be recorded. So if you have to hop off early or you want to share it with someone later, it will be uploaded onto YouTube. And so as a registered participant, you will get a link to this, and you'll also be able to find it on our website later. We also have live transcription enabled if that is a tool you would like to use today. You'll also see that chat is enabled, and feel free to use that however you'd like. However, when we get to the Q&A portion of today's program, we would like for you to exclusively use that tool, the Q&A tool, to give us questions. That's where we're going to pull from when we get to that portion of the program. You'll see that we're going to be using chat to post links for things that we're talking about today. So if we reference a website or a specific archive or a program we're working on, we'll post a link there that you can grab and use for later if you want to take a deeper dive into something. I think that is about it for my housekeeping. If you have any other technical questions, please feel free to put them in chat, and Kelsey will grab those and address those. So a quick intro to our program before we launch in. If this is your introduction to Monuments to Movements, welcome. We're very happy to have you in our network. Our full name of our organization is Monuments to Movements in the House of Radical Feminist Practices. And we are an initiative of a larger organization called Project And. We are an international group, a group of what we like to call movement builders. And together we envision, commission, and build monuments to movements, or as we also refer to, monuments to collective action. So instead of monuments to heroes or monuments to individuals, we focus on the work that we do together, what we accomplish in solidarity over time and over time zones. We also firmly situate our work in intersectional feminist practices and theory. And if you want to learn more about that, I do encourage you to go to the website. Today is the kickoff of our Let's Speak Easy program. And if you've looked into this, you'll see we have 5 of them scheduled once a month, first Tuesday of every month. And each one of these conversations is designed to attach to a specific initiative that we're working on in M2M. So today we're focusing on the archive. The next one we're focusing on a monument to human infrastructure. These are all current projects of ours. And so Let's Speak Easy is here to meet all of you, to discuss our ideas together, to encourage you to join our work and to collaborate. And also a chance for us to kind of update our audience and our public communities on where we are in a project and where we hope to go. So if you would like to register for further Let's Speak Easy, just hit our website and you'll see the rest of them. So today is not only the launch of Let's Speak Easy, it's also the launch of our first initiative, which is the archive that we have developed in collaboration with Urban Art Mapping Project. And this is an archive dedicated exclusively to cataloging and distributing and sharing information about monuments to movements. It is crowdsourced. That means we invite you to enter information about monuments to movements that you've been involved in or that you've seen or that have inspired you. And I am going to stop speaking about the archive project right now because we have Heather and Todd here who will speak about it so beautifully for you. And they're going to tell you more about the broader project of urban art mapping. So I pass it to you, Heather and Todd, now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with you. And Kelsey, could we please have that first slide too while we're just introducing the project? That would be great. Thank you so much. So I'm Heather Shirey. As Neysa mentioned, I'm an art history professor at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm co-director of the Urban Art Mapping Project. This is an interdisciplinary, multiracial, multi-generational research team. We work with our colleague Paul Laura, who's a geographer, and we have student researchers that include a high school junior, undergraduate students, graduate students from across the disciplines, and we all work together to systematically document street art globally, creating what Stuart Hall refers to as living archives, relating to the crises that we see shaping the world: COVID-19, systemic racism, and the environmental crisis. So by living archives, we mean that the body of material we collect, it's not fixed and frozen. It's constantly changing, it's constantly growing. It's never complete because there are always new works and new perspectives that can be incorporated. And we think this is an especially meaningful approach for our collaboration with Monuments to Movement, because archiving is in this way a kind of collective action, and collective action is ongoing and unending. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a slide that shows some members of our team at various stages, and a lot of our work involves engaging with the community, and there's some images here. And I will pass things to Todd to introduce himself and the project a little bit more too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Lawrence, and I'm a folklorist and an ethnographer, and also a faculty director of urban art mapping. Kelsey, if you could go to the next slide. This project, we started this project, urban art mapping, back in the fall of 2018. And at that time, we were working specifically in one neighborhood in St. Paul. We were documenting and mapping street art and trying to think about ways that sort of spatial factors would influence how we understood art. And also we came to think about the relationship between art in a neighborhood and how people responded to it, or how it impacted them on a daily basis. Eventually, we did that work for a couple of years and moved into some adjacent neighborhoods. But with the start of COVID-19 in the spring of 2020, we were shut down. All of our in-person interviewing and in-person documenting was shut down. And we were trying to figure out another way to sort of continue to work on street art. So we started to document street art online that was associated with COVID-19. And Heather started that in her living room. We were all stuck at home. And she started that on a spreadsheet, but eventually we realized that a database would be better, and it would be publicly accessible, and it would be a better way to sort of not just document and archive the art, but make it accessible to the public. And then shortly after that, George Floyd was murdered here in the Twin Cities. The uprising that followed that murder was centered in Minneapolis at Lake Street and Minnehaha, but in St. Paul, it was centered in the neighborhood where we've been doing our work. And so when we were out in the streets on the day after the uprising, we saw this real explosion of public art, of street art in the streets. And we knew that it would be, that it wouldn't last very long. A lot of it was politically oppositional, aesthetically challenging, not necessarily beautiful. Even, art that was just graffiti that would be seen as criminal activity. We wanted to preserve it because we thought it was part of an ongoing conversation. And so that's been a big part of what we have seen ourselves doing as archivists, as documenters and archivists, that's extending this conversation that happens in moments of crisis, and that happened in our neighborhood, in our city, but not just here, but across the country. And that goes along with our kind of slogan for our project, which is that walls speak and that we need to listen to them. So we're really excited to be partnering with Monuments to Movements and to create this new archive for to document and monuments that are about movements, that are about collective movements, because that's actually what was happening here in the Twin Cities when we decided to start our project.
And we have one last slide, Kelsey, if you don't mind going to the next one. We're very reliant on crowdsourcing. And in one sense, this is practical because we just can't be everywhere at once, obviously, and we want to be global. But it also is part of the philosophy, and I think Monuments to Movements really shares in this idea. We recognize that archives have typically and historically come from a place of power and represent the dominant voice, the dominant culture, as it wishes to be seen and remembered. And we recognize that BIPOC voices and experiences are severely underrepresented in the archives, for example. So we want to crowdsource, we want to build a community-based archiving system because it decenters authority. It lets the community also decide what should be documented, what should be preserved. And in this way, we think that archiving itself becomes a form of collective action. So we're really excited about this collaboration and excited to hear from some artists and talk about how their work also contributes to this record. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Heather and Todd. I'm Jane, as Neysa said, and I'm her co-conspirator in launching M2M and this incredible collaboration. And I mean, I think what's really important is to think about archives as generative cultural spaces for reevaluation and redefinition and action on a public and personal level. And like M2M, urban archives is adding to the canon. And I believe that when you add to the canon, you shift it forever. It is never the same because it must make room for new narratives, new stories, but also then you see things in very different relationship. And so I can't thank you enough for the work that you're doing because you are literally shifting the canon on archives. I also think that, you know, just the idea of in kind of the necessary deep reflection of the past, present, and future is also so much in your work, right? So it started as something that was so much of the moment, but in just doing that, you are reflecting on what wasn't recorded in the past that could have been. And I think that, you know, archives are places where we live in all tenses of the verb. And so are monuments and movements. And, you know, it's a community process that really looks wide-eyed, you know, at the past and really evaluates the systems of the present. I mean, just one of the last things, like, you know, what part of a knee on the neck is live and serve, right? So what are these systems of the present that we're actually coming up against, and really also embracing a collaborative moment that really arrives us here and gathers us for the design of our joint future, right? And so that's why I say past, present, and future. And that's why this collaboration is so extraordinary already. Both M2M and the Urban Archives really are making a very simple offering, and that's to join a reflective and innovative movement of a community process. And so that is also about kind of the essence of what we think of as access, which is you just have to come as your authentic self, right? And so to be part of the archive, to also be part of movements and monuments, it's the content of the character of our democracy, of our communities, and of us as individuals. So I just want to continue by introducing four artists who generously offered to give video interviews to really kick off a kind of like multiple artist voices about this conversation. And it's Lori Greene, Seitu Jones, Sam Kirk, and Mel Potter. And there was a question that kind of just kicked off the conversations with them. And it was, you know, please talk about your relationship of your work to movement building, and in what ways can archives support your work, you as an artist, the preservation, dissemination, or distribution of your work and the issues your work addresses. So without further delay, let's see what the four of them have to say.
My name is Lori Greene, and I am the artist that created the memorial to survivors of sexual violence on Boom Island in Minneapolis. I think the memorial, the majority of the memorial was built during the shutdown. And so I was really alone in my studio without my staff, without my assistants. And in many ways, I think that was really helpful because we were all in so much pain and so much fear, not knowing what was going to happen next. And I think that helped me to I already knew what the feeling was as a survivor, but it really helped me to kind of feel everyone's pain. But I also didn't want the memorial to be solely about pain, but about the process of healing. And so it's a 5-part memorial, one that starts with fear and pain and then moves through the process of healing. And healing, of course, is not linear. And most people who are survivors go through these feelings over and over again. But the hope is that people will go there and feel recognized and heard and see themselves, see where they're at in the process, and know that there's hope to move through it. I think the importance of documenting them is that at some point, we hope this memorial will not be needed. So we can document it, and then it can be gone. I think maybe that was the intention with war memorials at one point too, although they were more glamorization. In my opinion, a lot of war memorials are really glamorizing one particular person. So this is really different. I'm really grateful that there has been this change and that regular people, everyone can participate in memorials now. Like George Floyd's memorial, that so many people went there and it became a pilgrimage in a way. So I know that's kind of what happens at the memorial for sexual assault survivors too, is that people are leaving flowers, people are writing messages on the sidewalk. So we are seeing that it's being used in a really thoughtful, prayerful way. It's a very spiritual place.
I always have to go back, like Sankofa. Before I go ahead, I have to look back. And I think about my coming of age as an artist occurred in the late 1960s and early 70s. And this time of this, another time of political upheaval, and this time where all these different philosophies within the African American community on how we were going to progress were coming about. And I got hooked up into the Black cultural nationalism movement, got hooked up into the civil rights movement, as well as getting hooked up into the whole time of the 60s. You know, listening to Marvin Gaye one day, listening to Jimi Hendrix the other day, listening to old records, and they were records at that point in time, old LPs of Malcolm X speeches. I mean, all of that was this rich mix of time and culture that I was part of. And with all of those philosophies, one of the things that was emphasized over and over again is that you should leave your community more beautiful than you found it. It was a part of the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles. It was part of the Black Panther Party platform. And so I felt, and also getting tied up with some even Marxist-Leninist thought, I got tied up in wanting to make sure that my work and my work specifically as an artist would lead to changing the world. And so I, at that point, was part of the Black arts movement. So I was doing, one day I was doing posters for plays. Another day we were doing murals, a wide range of things. You know, all kinds of flyers for political rallies, doing pieces, illustrations for newspapers, you know, all about the movement in some way or another that we got hooked up in. And that, those tenets of those times really were my philosophic underpinnings and that carried me forth to today. I still try to make work from time to time that is my artistic vision, but part of that vision is to change the world still to this point in time. So that's kind of where I am with monuments to movements.
Hey Neysa, hey Jane. All right, let's get into these questions. Please talk about the relationship of your work to movement building, and in what ways can archives support your work as an artist? Okay, well, my work is largely informed by current events and how history has played a role in the lives that we currently live today. A lot of the content of my work talks about subjects that unfortunately aren't new, you know, like they're issues that we've been dealing with for many decades. But I feel like my role as an artist is to figure out how can I use this visual tool to address these things differently, or put the work in a place where people might receive it in a different way. And as one of the things I love about creating public art, as a public artist, I'm able to take these narratives and put them into the public space so that people can, you know, debate on them. I get social commentary, and ultimately challenge perspectives. I'm really trying to move in parallel with a lot of the movements that are currently taking place, while also still addressing things that have been on the table for a long time. And I love being able to create public works, not just because of the content, but also because of the placement, right? I think the location of these pieces is key, because where we choose to put the messages or where we choose to put these visuals interacts with a different crowd or a different community. And maybe, you know, that hasn't been something that has been necessarily brought up too often in these different neighborhoods. But regarding archives, I would say archives are supportive in my work because as a public artist, my work isn't permanent. So I'm grateful to have archives to look back at for my own work, for others' works. I think it helps to not only tell the story of what was happening in the neighborhoods and what the communities were dealing with, but also if the artwork was effective, if that was the goal of it. I often wonder why artists create the work that they create and, you know, what their goals are for the work. And I think good documentation could help us to understand, you know, why the artist created that particular piece, why in that community, what was happening in the neighborhood, and it could help us to understand, you know, how things have progressed or changed over time.
It was actually M2M that helped me conceptualize gardens as a form of monument making. We often think of gardens as memorial, but in fact, they are often monument. They are monument to communities, thematically to certain types of food, to herbal practices, to local communities and endemic plants in that region or area. So I've really come to think of them as monument making. They are by nature temporary, cyclical, and ephemeral. And as such, I have embraced them as an ecofeminist practice, really looking at the ways that nothing is ever truly permanent, and that is foundational to living with dignity and respect for the land. I am a community garden worker, and I've never had my own workspace. I've never had my own art studio or outdoor space to farm or garden. This has been incredibly generative because the collaborations that I do have been really thought-provoking. It's also been dangerous because much of the private property that I have gardened on extensively has been sold for building, for construction, and demolished. And so when I think about the importance of an archive, I think about, of course, creating a record of a garden that, if given the opportunity, can come back, but if demolished, is never again. But also thinking about an archive as a way for people to understand that this is the kind of work they can do on their own behalf and for their own communities. So when I think about gardening, I also think of it as an iterative process, one that inspires people to do more. And so an archive is a way to disseminate that information, to move it into spaces, actually disseminate not being a very feminist way of describing it, to distribute the way one would distribute seeds and distribute the plants and distribute the things that are grown inside of a garden. And that it has really radicalized my concepts around private ownership, that gardens and open space are a human right. And this is something in the modern era we learned more than ever during the pandemic, and it's something we should fight for. And that's also, I believe, the power of the garden and the garden as monument, and the M2M movement, which is reconceptualizing not only monuments, but how we think about public space as a human right for all.
Okay, I want to thank the artists. They're so brilliant and so inspiring. And I know the four of us, I feel like it's already influenced how we're thinking about monuments and archives, just having these videos. So thanks to Lori and Seitu and Sam and Mel. I know some of you are here with us today on this program. We're so grateful that you took the time to make these videos, to respond to our questions, but also to have your work in the archive. Because as those of you that really helped launch the archive with us, you know, you work so closely with us to get us the documentation and do writing and everything. And we're so grateful, and we hope it inspires other artists to contribute to the archive. So there's so much to talk about. We could talk about each one of these videos for an hour. We will be turning it over to group Q&A in just a few moments. But first, I want to ask the three of you, what are your initial responses to this?
Well, if I'll jump in, I really loved, I mean, I've seen those videos before, but seeing them again just now really resonated with me. And I was actually drawn to, you know, something that Melissa said about the archives being a place where people can encounter art that they then can sort of realize they can create themselves, right? Like, and I think, you know, for monuments to movements, but also, you know, specifically for urban art mapping, our George Floyd database, for example, even just seeing the art on the street in public space, I think for a lot of people was an inspiration to create art of their own. and to engage in a public discourse and dialogue around crisis in this point, social, political crisis, et cetera. But that people can be inspired by seeing this art. And that part of the reason why, our city, for example, wanted to get rid of a lot of this art and clean it up really quickly is because they knew that that's precisely what would happen, would be that people would be inspired by the art. So the archive can be a way of extending that and of providing a space where people can be inspired both to create art, but to be involved in collective movements for justice. So I think that really resonated with me.
I think today I was really struck listening to these interviews by just the ways that the artists talked about how they participate in collective action. Melissa talked about the idea of working in gardens and this kind of ongoing participatory nature of her work. Sam talked about this idea of how to put narratives out in public space and get dialogues going through art. And I was really struck when Lori talked about how creating this work was a way, or it required her to feel everyone's pain and the weight and the power of that, but the ultimate release of that too by making the work of art. And then Seitu, I think, summed it up when he said that his art is about thinking about how we're going to progress. How are we going to progress? How does art help us all together collectively progress? So I saw that as a kind of thread that was woven through all of these interviews that really resonated with me today.
For me, I think that right? And so much of what the archive is about on M2M is the we, right? Why is there a single hero? There's actually never a single hero or a single devil, if we want to put it that way, that kind of creates these massive shifts. And I think, the idea of making of memory and kind of the politics of archives and libraries and museums and monuments, right? And the idea that we are constructing national and social conscience, right? And that's what we're doing, right? It's not a single memory, but it's this idea of communities making memory and how impactful that is, and obviously feeds right into movements. And then actually when I was watching them again last night, it reminded me of this quote from the amazing philosopher, writer Hannah Arendt that talks about the chances of factual truth surviving the onslaught of power are very slim indeed. It's always in danger of being maneuvered out of the world, not only for a time, but potentially forever. Once they are lost, no rational effort will ever bring them back. And I think Sam spoke to that. I think, the fact that you guys really started launching this as an archive, this idea that, whether we could even talk about, the video that actually made what we call the George Floyd experience real, right? Was this idea of documentation, of making it real and not letting power eliminate facts or ideas. And so I think that's something that I think is just so incredible. It's like once it is documented and it exists, it can never not exist again.
Yeah, and that really intersects with what Sam was talking about. Archives are so important for her work because her work is going to be ephemeral. If she wants it to stay up longer or she wants it to come down, public artists aren't always in control. And a lot of the artists talked about this, right? Mel's talking about, hey, my work gets demolished sometimes. She sometimes has no heads up about that at all. A huge garden she's been working on for years is just leveled. And, and Lori Greene talked about that as well in something that really took me back when she said, a goal here is that this memorial will not have to exist, right? If violence against women is no longer a thing, we no longer need this memorial. And that's, it just really stunned me because you're also looking at these as really extraordinary works of art and what she went through almost as this medium of other people's pain and experience that she translated and collaborated with so many other people. To hear her say a goal would be that this will no longer exist. And so it also, I think ties into potentially another thing we've talked about so much is, the value of an archive to public artists. And something else we talk about sometimes is how these archives are not really neutral, right? They're not just repositories of art collections, that there are perspectives here and intentions and viewpoints that all of these artists share, but also, us as archivers. Does anybody want to comment on that? Something I've heard you talk about a lot, that archives aren't neutral.
Yeah, I think for us, that's a really big part of, our thinking about the work that we do, and specifically because, and Heather mentioned this earlier, that we think of this as a sort of community-based archive because there are people, the community is deciding what goes in the archive, right? We don't have the ability to archive this art all over around the world, not even in this city. We couldn't even really do that ourselves. But the fact that people are deciding what is important to them, there are, I think there are benefits and drawbacks to that, but ultimately they are making those decisions. And so we make some decisions, about what goes in and what doesn't go in, but we collect everything. Like, it's more like what goes live and what doesn't go live. And that's something that we don't take lightly, because, it's really important about what's visible and accessible for people to be able to look at. And I just wanted to say one other thing. I mean, I just was thinking about what Jane said, and this attempt to reframe the narrative, to retell the story, is already happening around George Floyd, right? And I think, we're really fortunate that we are living in a moment when people are really paying a lot of attention to archiving and documenting and recording things. People sort of complain about, this sort of like social media and everything online and all that. But there's something good about it, which is that everything, so much gets preserved. And I think, we were at George Floyd Square in Minneapolis is a great example, right? This is a spontaneous memorial to a movement that sort of comes up right after George Floyd is murdered. It's at the place where he was murdered. But really quickly, within a day or two, someone, Janelle Austin and a group of preservationists decided to save everything that people were bringing to that site. Everything, all of the offerings, all the pieces of art, everything. They decided to save it all, which is an extraordinary undertaking, right? And so they have created an archive of actual objects, right? Which is a huge, huge, huge job. And if they hadn't done that, much of that would have been just thrown away. It would have just been discarded, and it would be, easier to forget the scale and the magnitude of that place and the amount of sort of emotional processing and everything that was happening there. And we've come in, sort of secondarily, and try to take images to make that more accessible, right? Because not everybody can come to George Floyd Square and visit it in person, and they don't have, the mechanism or the building to display all this stuff they hope to in time. It's not there yet, so we're sort of playing a role, a part in a sort of larger project that a lot of people are involved in, which is to preserve and to maintain a particular narrative about these events that empowers the people who were a part of it. And I think that's important.
I think, Todd, what you're saying about this idea of ultimately it's about power, right? And about the power to construct narratives and determining the value of the present that also will impact the future. But it's also about a shared power, right? And so power is often talked about as if it's bad inherently, but it isn't, It's like, what do you cook it with, right? And so who's cooking it and who has the power? But also just what you're saying about the shared power. So it is a constellation of power, and everyone has a different role in actually using that power to construct different narratives. And that's a really important part of it, that, just what you're talking about now, about what your role is as opposed to somebody else.
And I think we do end up constructing those kind of narratives through an archive. And this might also address the first question that's coming in too about these kind of narratives that we construct, because when we put together an archive, there's so many different ways you can choose to organize information, and there's power in that, right? So we started with street art. We could have organized it by graffiti, commission murals, stickers. I mean, we could have made that decision, but we decided to organize it by themes. And we wanted to be able to honor and memorialize George Floyd and other individuals, but we also wanted to look at systemic racism. And so we have themes like critiquing policing and, Black Lives Matter as a movement. And so that was a choice we made in terms of how to organize the archive. And so in some ways, the archive has a collection of information and it has these fairly neutral descriptions of art objects, but it's organized in collections that have a kind of thought to them that piece together some key concepts to explore. And I'd be curious to talk a little bit more about how you think of that in relationship to monuments, to movements too, because you also have these movements that you have to identify. And it's not always easy from the outside to be able to look at a work and decide exactly what movement it pertains to. So that's something to think about going forward too. And I wonder if you two have any thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, something we're talking about now with you all is when maybe a work seems to intersect with several movements, and or it's a movement that maybe didn't exist for too long. We're just learning about it or learning more about it, like a work in there by Michelle Hartney that's Mother's Rights, about birth rights, and just kind of learning more about the history of this movement, and that it has a name and that we can now identify it and attach it in correlation to other works is just an ongoing learning process for us. I think another thing along those lines is talking to artists about where maybe we see movement building in their work that they had not identified. Saying, well, we think this is part of the voting rights movement or LGBTQ movement or something where where we start having that conversation, and that's been it's just really opened up a lot of fields of inquiry for us. And of course, sometimes artists are like, no, my work has nothing to do with that, but I do kind of now see it attached to this other movement. And so there's a lot of interpretation. I guess that goes along with kind of like the neutrality or the narrative, where you're kind of figuring this out together. And artists are introducing works into the archive where, again, we don't have a collection name for that or a movement name for that. And then we get to start this whole new thread.
I'd just like to jump in on that, because I think that there's this idea that when we look back at movements, that they were calcified, named, tagged, footnoted, and everybody decided what they meant. And these are generative processes and movements. People try to pinpoint a moment it began or ended. And for me, coming up at the time of kind of the early days of the AIDS crisis in the US, yes, it was part of this LGBT liberation movement, right? That started at Stonewall, and it was about gender and gender identity and orientation and all this stuff. And then it was about a disease that we were dying of, our community, and that showed up in different populations in different ways, and that the government didn't care about. And so it was a movement that brought together issues of gender, and feminism, and issues of identity and gender identity and race and class and all of those kinds of things. And it wasn't a movement, but it definitely was in the rivers and the tributaries of other movements, right? And then I think about the anti-apartheid movement that I was very much part of, and when that became part of other movements, right? And so I think it is, what's interesting is for us to think about how in the past there is this idea of calcification and cataloging, and that somehow there's a beginning, an end, and a middle. And we know, right, like the voting rights struggles over, right? Well, actually, it's worse now than it was when the bill was passed, right? And so I think that is the idea of speaking of the porous thresholds and how things actually do overlap.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I, when I was talking to Seitu, when we recorded that video, I asked him, about the George Floyd movement, and he talked about the Black Arts Movement, right?
Mhm.
And he was basically saying that the work that he did then is connected to the work that he is doing now, work that he, you know, made available. Like he did the stencil you saw in the video that he made available to anyone who wanted to put it up on walls, and it became like this sort of iconic thing around our city. But I think that you know, the movement that he talked about, he didn't talk about it in terms of necessarily ideological certainty, right? He just basically said it was about trying to change the world. He didn't even, you got the sense that how you might do that was contested even during the movement. And but that you should do something to try to gain that sort of objective, and that's what he was doing today, even though in some ways it was different, in some ways it was the same, you know. So I think like that's a really great point to hold on to when it comes to thinking about movements and work that archives can show. I mean, you know, there are some archives of art of the movement, of the Black Arts Movement. I wish we had everything that was produced, and that would be, we would be able to see that even more clearly. But what we have shows us, you know, what is possible to see, and that includes the art, that includes the narratives of people who created it, people who were living at that time. Like that's what we're trying to do now, I think, and everybody is sort of contributing to it in different ways. And so my hope is that, you know, when it comes to George Floyd, or it comes to COVID-19, or it comes to monuments to movement, that we'll have this kind of like collective sort of produced record of what was going on and how people were responding to it and what they thought was important and what they were speaking to.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important, Todd. And I think that it also helps us see the process of how movements grow and develop, right? Because thinking about Seitu, okay, we've got this, it's really a portrait, it's really a memorial to one individual, but it spreads throughout the world and it becomes a movement. And so seeing that kind of transformation from George Floyd as an individual who were mourning to a movement that's much broader, I mean, it's really incredible to be able to see that play out. And I think an archive helps us track how that happens over the time.
We have one new question. Now that the metaverse and NFTs are taking off, has there been any consideration of exploratory digital archives?
That's a good question. That might be over my head.
I don't feel incredibly qualified to talk about NFTs right now. I don't know. Does anybody
Could you put an NFT in an archive? I mean, because I guess that would be, I don't know. Yeah, I'm with you. Like that's a little bit over my head, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I was, when this question came in, I was curious if like your students are asking you about this, like, can we add NFTs or something like that? Because I don't know. Has that come up in your conversations yet around urban art mapping?
It hasn't come up for us yet, so I don't actually feel qualified to answer that question either.
Yes. I'm sorry, we can't.
I mean, I think
now we're going to talk about
to think about the idea of new mediums and new ways of expressing, right? I mean, here we all are on Zoom, you know, like no big deal, right? And that this is real life. But I think that it is really important to think about, you know, what does it mean when Neysa and I first started to put forward the fact that we're supporting ephemeral work, right? And the idea that things don't have to last, and people are like, monuments last. And we're like, well, maybe they don't, right? And so I do think that although none of us are experts on that, although all of us are reading a lot and talking a lot and have lots of friends and artists and that we know that are really getting into it, I think the idea of what does it mean about something lasting and who does it last for, right? And how does something have to last? And what's the temporal quality that supports a narrative? And so I do think that those are important questions, although I don't know that that's something that we have been thinking about. Although Monuments Movements is going to start a fellowship project for individual artists. And that may be something that an individual artist wants to investigate and think about. And hopefully we'll be using that form in a very philosophical way. Because I will end with this, that as much as I'm pro technology, I also think that there has to be a reason to use it. So then that's also really interesting conversation is, why would you make something in an NFT that's about community building? And I think there really could be a great investigative process in that. So that's what kicking the invisible ball.
I was just thinking that, we have had, so I think there's this thing about our archive that some people think it's like really technologically like advanced and innovative, and other people would be like, that's so basic, we're just archiving photographs and sometimes videos. But we did work with some photographers in the Twin Cities on a 3D model of George Floyd Square that we had hoped to include in the database, and that hasn't ever come to fruition. But we saw a version of it that we were going to like link to in our database, and it was amazing. Like, it was this amazing 3D detailed model of George Floyd Square where you could like click on things and then objects or pieces of art or something like that. And so that was like, we really thought that was going to be amazing. Like I said, it hasn't come to fruition. I think we can't, there are other ways that, and other kinds of technologies that may come to play a role in our archive or in the M2M archive eventually that maybe we don't even know about yet, maybe we haven't imagined yet. But we're just sort of like using what makes sense now, what people have access to now, and what allows us to document the most art and monuments that we can, I think.
So let me ask a final question, because I know we're heading near the end, and there's another question from one of the people who are attending. What do you think should be done with all the problematic monuments that have been taken down? And maybe everybody could answer that, and then maybe Neysa, you can close us out.
Yes, I have I don't know, maybe unpopular opinions about what should be done with the monuments that come down. And I'm just one opinion. Jane and I talk a lot about that we're really not so concerned about what monuments should be toppled or what should happen to them. We're much more concerned about creating new works together, collaborating together, commemorating things that have always been less visible, less explored, undertold. That's really where our focus is. I guess I would just say, having been a museum professional for more than half my career, I do not think these monuments should be the burden of museums, because for all the reasons of being a nonprofit and having to take in gigantic monuments where you're already strapped for funding, and now have to interpret a Confederate monument that's just been taken down somewhere. So that would be part of my answer to that. Anybody else?
Todd and Heather?
Yeah, I think so. My answer is sort of informed, I think, by my cultural studies sort of part of my training, which is, and to think about space, right? And actually, it's been informed by being a Black man too, right? Like when I think about, sort of like Monument Row in Richmond or something like that, right? Where there's this large number of these monuments to white supremacy. I think about the trauma of like having to exist in that space, right? And having to sort of move through that space. I tell a story about, the uprising here in the Twin Cities, which is that, I live in the Midway neighborhood, which is a neighborhood under sort of economic and social pressure, gentrifying, the space is changing. And even though I live here and really love the neighborhood, there were ways that the neighborhood was changing with, these big apartment buildings and like all this new stuff being built that was, in my sense, a kind of monument to capitalism, which I found to be really uncomfortable and disconcerting, and made being in the public space of the neighborhood very uncomfortable for me. And yet on the morning after the uprising, when that space had been transformed by art everywhere on all the buildings, on the posts and everything like that, I felt way more comfortable in the space that some people would call, it had been, destroyed or had been, damaged or whatever. I felt way more comfortable in that space, which seemed to me to be more welcoming to me as a Black man, as a Black person, than the space had been the day before, when it was filled with all this sort of shiny glass and metal and all that kind of stuff of these buildings, which most people who lived in the neighborhood for 20 years couldn't afford to live in.
I just want to add one last thing, which is I'm not in favor of book burning and toppling and destroying. I think that we have to actually look at the truth of who we've been, right? And I always joke with Neysa, it's like ripping up all the photos of yourself on a bad hair day, you know? It's like, no, actually that was you, right? And I do think that it's really important now, you know, knock down, move, but I do think that when we take away the things that we actually at some point embraced, that we have to have a real reckoning. And if we just remove them, it's like it didn't happen, and it did, and it does, and it still will. So I'm not sure where they should go. So Neysa, final word.
We have to find some sort of in between, right? Like we have to find some way to deal with both of those things, to not erase who we have been, but to not, but to help people who have been, you know, sort of marginalized by those memorials to be able to live in a space that feels welcoming and that includes them as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's the perfect way to sum that up, right? Good. Nobody should have to live in these public spaces where they're intimidated and offended. That was a perfect way to wrap it up. Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Heather. And thank you, Jane. And thank you, Kelsey and Marcela and everybody that came and contributed today. So this completes our first Let's Speak Easy. Please join us again next month. February 8th is with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, another one of our monument initiatives to human infrastructure. So thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your week.
Thanks.